Like you said, I'm Abe Adams. I'm with Targeted Victory. We are a public affairs and marketing firm based out of the D.C. area. Kind of how I'm going to approach this is I've kind of broken it into three parts just because the political space is a very unique beast in the sense that what we're trying to achieve uses a lot of the same tactics that have been discussed over the last 2 days, but there are some unique constraints. One of the things is that we have 73 days until the election, and that is the lifespan of the campaign. We have to spin down to 0 by 73 days, or we're leaving votes on the table. And so when you build out with that model, you have to kind of approach it and understand where are opportunities, how are we targeting, and then what are we doing from a messaging standpoint to leverage all the different segments that might make up your voting block that you're trying to leverage to win. And so just to kind of start off, just talking about perspective of how we look at audiences and understand the general dynamic of the country right now, there's a strong team mentality. There's a strong approach that, like, when you're sitting in a room planning a campaign, kind of coming up with a strategy, that everybody in the room represents who the voters are that we're going after. And the reality is it's far from that most of the time. And so I always use this slide to kind of start off because most of the times the people I'm talking to, our firm represents center of right politics. And most of the time we're in New York, LA, Chicago doing presentations. And most of the people in the room are from agencies. And they're from, they either grew up in urban populations or they kind of come, and they don't realize that like there's a team mentality on both sides of the equation. And so this is a lot of times the rooms we walk into, we like to tell everybody just for a second, just realizing that if you look at whether it's the smallest election or the biggest election, the reality is a lot of times thousands of votes make up the difference. I mean, take the national election last year. You had 60 million people vote for one side, 60 million people vote for the other side. And the reality is those voting blocks break up into very distinct different groups. And how we approach it is starting with the messaging and understanding who we're talking to. And if you look at the national media today, and this is pretty much true of all national media, how politics has kind of taken over the share of voice in terms that you would think if you look at the national media, there's one message all the time to everybody, and this is all everybody's talking about. And the reality is when we operate and we build out our campaigns, our messaging strategy and plans, we have to actually go beyond this and break it down into a very local conversation. What is your representative? What is your candidate or issue actually? How it's being affected? And one of the kind of takeaways is a lot of times people are like, well, how do you make election local? Why is that important? Well, if you don't make an election local and you don't talk about what really matters to people, that is how the mayor of Jaws is the mayor of Jaws in Jaws 2. And he did not get voted out for some reason. Not really sure why, but he didn't. And so, yeah, exactly. But so if you look at local issues, you actually realize that like there's a huge, there's a wide range of what's actually being discussed at any given point. And what we do to leverage that is a lot of our campaigns have to spin up in days. And so we're looking at what's being talked about in earned media, what our polling and tracking is showing, what people are actually paying attention to. And that can be anything from a local issue around, I've got a campaign right now going around red snapper limits and another campaign going around whether their local sports teams are going to be supported. And so we actually have to drill down into how those segments actually get broken out. And so just to kind of circle back up to the overall numbers to understand how we approach our segments and audiences is we build off the voter file, which is basically a collection of all the voter data that from state to state. And there are organizations that, and we can, in the political space, can leverage that like first-party data because we can build and model off of all of the actual election information. And so and why that's critical is because even though there are 300 plus million people in the country, and over 200 million can vote. When you actually break down how these elections kind of start to really unfold from a math standpoint, less than 10 million people really make the difference in a national election in terms of being persuadable and having even an ability to move them from one point to the other. And you take that and break that down into over 400 congressional districts and Senate races and such, you have thousands of people that you're trying to move. And so we run into issues all the time with like the size of the audience that we're talking to does not scale to the level to be able to reach them on certain channels. And so those are limitations that we have to deal with. So kind of how do we start our breakdown? We look at it from an audience perspective. We break it down into understanding who our base, who our movable numbers are, and then we build campaign plans to that. And so a strategy would be to take your audience like this, depending on what type of race it is, and then actually segment it out and decide how am I going to get to 50 plus 1. And it's a different model than a lot of times what you see in the consumer space, just because the audiences are so much smaller and we're not necessarily trying to reach beyond those audiences. Once a strategy is kind of formulated that we know exactly which segments we're going to try to move them, we build the campaigns around that. And it's a tricky dynamic because when we are trying to find partners whether it's at the advertising level or at the data level, a lot of times we run into issues where people try to leverage the same tactics they do in the consumer space, and they don't realize that with a 72-day window, that in the reality is a lot of our flights are less than 10 days, just because within a 72-day window, the average campaign will try to push around 6 to 7 messages, that you just run into an issue of timing, an issue of scale, and that's kind of the hurdle that we're always trying to get around. So where are our opportunities? Where do we see the biggest growth areas for us from a digital perspective? So that what this kind of chart shows is this is a breakdown about DMA for broadcast television per impression that we kind of built out. The reason why we use this as kind of a talking point, if you will, is that because our elections are defined by geo, and for a statewide race in Iowa, they can't vote. If a DMA carries out into another state, we can't actually advertise there because they can't vote in this election. So if you start actually adding a layer of geo on top of the data and audiences that we have, you actually will see that we see a 60x difference from running a broadcast ad in Des Moines versus running it in Boston. And so from a digital perspective, that gives us a lot of opportunity to make the case that we provide a much more cost-effective solution in these DMAs that have a much higher, and you can call it wasteful, television approach. And so what we like to do is we like to create a level playing field across the board, plan out from that standpoint, understand where our opportunities for reach are across all the different channels, and then build our media plan holistically from the ground up using those different DMAs. And so what we've seen over the last year is how that's kind of playing. Once we're kind of on the ground, we actually have a campaign live. Because we're turning around so fast, and it's because our campaigns are, a lot of times we don't know when we're starting the campaign if the campaign's going to change direction because of a poll in like 10 days. We refresh creative every 3 to 5 days a lot of times on our direct response ads. So if somebody's trying to run something that says, will you support a petition or initiative, 3 to 5 days later, the entire news cycle may change. And so what we've seen is that our most cost-effective acquisitions, actually, we kind of start to see a creative fatigue after about a frequency of 3 or 4 times. And so it's something that we've seen unique in the political space, and because of the time frame that we're actually turning around creative, we were talking about in the video, one of the video Q&As, we've actually gotten to the point where we're taking our video creative and changing 2 to 3 seconds of it on the front end every 3 to 5 days just to keep it fresh, to keep it going, and keep our cost per acquisition down pretty low. And how this works for us on the client side. So when we're talking to our clients, and a lot of the people in this room actually have political offerings, and we work with a number of firms in here, is you understand that like our clients are not necessarily sophisticated buyers. A lot of times we don't have a brand manager on the other side of the equation, or a advertising team on the other side of the equation that we're talking to. So a lot of times what we have to do is really create some very simple rules that we try to teach our campaigns, and we've broken them down into kind of 6 ideas. And these we've found have been very helpful from a planning standpoint in getting them to kind of buy into the concept of not only digital, but understanding that, you know, Facebook and Google aren't the only opportunities out there. We explain to them that like creative does drive results. Every platform, we approach creative, every platform differently. We unify the entire media experience in terms of our planning so that they understand the value of programmatic versus, you know, television versus something else. And in our equations, we have to go offline as well, so mail, phones, etc. In terms of voter contact. So, and then, like I said, we have these set audiences, and once they buy into these audiences, we typically don't deviate very much from just the model that's built out. And then at the end of the day, what a lot of the things people talked about all week long, viewability, brand safety, all of that still comes into play. It's just we have to kind of consider this from a very fast turnaround, and understanding that the level of sophistication from our client is, you know, typically just how many people are we reaching within our audience. And like Steve said, we're trying to get them away from that, understanding that we can have a better impact if we understand better not only how we're reaching them, but, you know, what is the quality of that contact and what we're doing to kind of continue to push that message over the course of whatever that flight or campaign is. And so, you know, we've leveraged a lot of the people in this room, a lot of companies to kind of bring new technology. We're always kind of pushing the alpha and beta opportunities to our clients from a firm standpoint, and that's one of the things that I think campaigns have, because we don't have a lot of barriers from an approval standpoint. That was one of the things both the Trump campaign and Hillary's campaign were able to do, is they had so much money going into the digital space. They were constantly testing and pushing new creative out, new ideas out. And so the political space is a great opportunity for that, just because we don't have, you know, there's no set, you know, playbook, if you will, that we have to run by. And one of the things that we found last cycle on the DR side is that people were not using Facebook on the political side, or really a lot of places were not using video very effectively in the DR space. And we started just testing message after message after message. And because what we try to do on the DR side is both collect information on vote affiliation, but we also do a lot of fundraising. And that was one area that we saw a lot of these learnings around creative fatigue and about having, you know, a strong kind of turnover in terms of keeping the creative active, that we saw a huge amount of success. And so just continuing to leverage both new platforms, new technology, how people are able to spin up audiences faster has been really successful for us on both the programmatic side, but just digital as a whole. And then finally, like we do try to steer most of our clients away from the vanity metrics. You know, we're lucky in the sense that a lot of the conversations this week, it seems like there's a lot of problems in the consumer space around brand awareness and just getting people back to understanding that sometimes you do have to run those campaigns. Fortunately for us, brand awareness is a lot because at the end of our day, our number one KPI is winning an election. So a lot of times the results aren't until election day for our actual client. But we've started to educate and teach our campaigns to understand that, every campaign, even though we're moving fast, even though we can put some standards in place and put some quality control in place so they understand what the real outcomes are, and so that they're not, they're using their dollars most effectively. And so, with that said, I'd love to, take some questions. And the political space is very unique, and that I'm pretty open to talking about anything that we're seeing. So.
Yeah, okay. Brittany Mitchell from State Farm.
Yeah.
That was a really interesting presentation. Thanks for sharing. Can you talk more about when you say just changing the first couple seconds of video or changing creative so quickly? How many messages do you plan in advance, and how do you handle production costs?
So production costs for us, it's client by client, because a lot of times for us, a statewide client or a national client is a completely different beast from a local candidate. So for them, they don't really have a production budget. A lot of times it's just making decisions on the fly as to if something's working, are they willing to invest more in it. For a national campaign, you just basically build out a creative budget that assumes that you're going to be testing a new piece of creative every 3 to 5 days, especially on their direct response campaigns. And so from a tactical standpoint of how we do it is, like you would in any other kind of campaign, you'd have a content calendar, and a lot of times what we're doing is just rolling out multiple concepts, and as the messaging narrative or the earned media messaging around the news changes, we'll fit whatever we're doing, and we're just constantly testing to see where we're getting a better rate of return. So.
We have a bunch of questions. We'll get to everybody.
Okay.
Abe, thanks so much for coming. My name is Jake. Since you're more of an expert than I'm guessing most of us ever have a chance to ask, what is your take on fake news? Like, I imagine at one end of the spectrum, it's like totally overblown because it doesn't really have the reach that you think it does based on how much coverage it gets. And on the other end of the spectrum, maybe it's, oh wow, those Russians are so good at marketing, we could really learn a thing or three from them.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's a great question. I mean, so from a campaign standpoint, when you talk about fake news, a lot of times what you're talking about, or what I guess what I should say is the conversation is constantly commingled in terms of what people are actually asking about. If you're talking about fake news as it relates to a campaign, people have been running, propaganda campaigns since the beginning of, elections. And that's everything from people putting flyers on people's cars outside of churches to, now you have these national campaigns. So, I mean, it's not like this is brand new from at a tactical standpoint. Now, when you start getting into talking about what, Facebook's dealing with and what we're talking about from the Russian perspective, it is an issue. And I mean, I think what we're dealing with now, and because it's so new, I didn't really want to talk about it too in depth, is that there's a lot of transparency reporting going on right now that Facebook and Google are self-regulating themselves around. And so I was telling somebody the other day, I mean, as of last week, we can only run, on Facebook specifically, we can only run ads from a political organization in the newsfeed. The reason why is because that's the only place they've built out the disclaimers. So from a fake news perspective, I mean, it's pretty difficult now on Facebook, based on how they've currently set it up, to run the ads the same way that the ads that were the so-called ads in 2016 were run from these, shadow groups. And the reality is that most of the shadow groups they can be anything from someone in their basement just creating their own version of a news story to, like you said, governments playing a role and having an impact. But I mean, they're definitely, I would say, from a digital perspective, I think some of the organizations are trying to address it with these self-regulating transparency kind of protocols that they're putting in place. At a national level, when you talk about fake news as it's used as a narrative, I mean, I think it's more of a talking point than it is necessarily something that's easily defined. if that makes sense. I mean, it means something different to every person. And so I think what we try to do as an organization is understand how we're leveraging what objectives we're trying to reach for our client, and then figure out if the fake news narrative is part of that and how you navigate it. So.
Hey, thank you. Anthony with TiVo. Question regarding audiences. We all know it's all about audiences.
Yep.
Aside from scale and cost, what do you look for strategically when selecting audiences?
So
segments.
Yeah.
Purchasing segments.
So basically, the two areas that kind of make up your starting place when we look at audiences are basically voter affinity. If there are signals that you have that could help us determine voter affinity, and then and we look at vote history, because vote history is going to determine the propensity that you are to vote. And so when you look at that grid that I kind of laid out, XY axis is voter affinity and vote propensity. And so what our data teams typically spend a lot of time on is trying to determine if whatever product a data vendor might have might help add some level to either one of those two factors. If it's a signal that can help us better determine, and I should say this, it's not just voter affinity in terms of I vote Republican or I vote Democrat. It could be issue-based. A lot of what we do is around specific issues, and so we were talking to somebody yesterday saying, like, to better understand, I mean, if you're running a campaign in Indiana and you're in a statewide, the voters in the suburbs of Chicago, the voters in downtown Indianapolis, the voters on the donut population around Indianapolis, and then in southern Indiana, if you look at them on that kind of XY axis, they're all over the place. I mean, it's a very unique group in each one of those areas, and so what we're always trying to do is figure out if a product you have or someone has can help us, either learn more or reach more within those audiences.
Hi, Denise Indovina with Ultimate Data. If you were going to advise a very small campaign with limited budget about what do they need to get right from the very beginning, what are the 3 to 4 things that they should be looking at and putting in place in order to have the best opportunity to succeed in their election, what would those things be?
So I truly believe that at a small campaign, I truly believe that campaigns can be won if you understand, like, if you do make them local and you make them about the people around. And so that plays into what we do from a digital perspective, because it is very important for you to understand your audience and know, like, when you break down what it would take to win that election and who those people are and what they're interested in. So, like, the things I would make sure you focus on, and this kind of gets out just outside the advertising perspective, but, like, make sure you have a strong social presence, where you actually are telling your story. Make sure that when you define your audience, that you understand, either from polling or data that you've collected, that what matters most to those folks. And you have to look at their intensity too. If people don't know who you are, then you may have to take a much more like brand awareness type campaign. Whereas if people know who you are because you're running for state senate and you've been deputy sheriff, and so you have you have some kind of brand ID, like, some of those factors will change. But I mean, I would say the top 2 things, in my opinion, are knowing who you're going after, and then making sure you have a very strong kind of social presence initially on a small campaign.
Abe, you mentioned video and that you're looking and doing more in terms of video. This cycle, one of the big stories when it comes to digital media for campaigns is the big hero video. Yeah. that every candidate seems to need. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you move beyond that, how are you using video? Are you using it mainly in sort of short pre-rolls? Are you using sort of, minute, 2-minute mini docs for your, what form is video taking that's most effective right now?
The great thing about what we're trying to do, and I've heard a lot of people talk about it over the last 2 days, is, we're trying to not treat we're not trying to treat any piece of creative as if it's the holy grail, and not trying to treat any piece of creative as if it by itself can work across every platform and somehow be successful. So from a video perspective, the traditional way campaigns have been run is you have anywhere from 3 to 6, like an average size campaign, anywhere from 3 to 6 television commercials that are 30-second commercials, maybe a 60-second in there, and people just taking what they had and they've just leveraged it across as many platforms as they could, just with that being the only creative. We've completely moved away from that. So we're not only approaching kind of our creative planning to make sure that you have those 30-second spots for sure, but we also have the 15-second spots. We also, now we're making 6-second spots. But my firm specifically focuses on, we like to tell people that we focus on doing 14-second or shorter, and doing as many as possible, and doing a lot of, leveraging motion regardless of whether you call that video or not, but it's still on a lot of platforms can be treated the same. So we do a lot of infographics, motion graphics, where we're using movement to kind of create engagement, but it's telling the same story, but it's not just using a 50 or 30-second spot over and over and over again thinking it's going to work. Because we've seen on our 30-second spots on Facebook that we've pretty much moved away from using any 30-second spot on Facebook. We use 15-second or shorter, and then we use 30-second spots. We'll still use them in the open web and on YouTube and some other channels, because we do see pretty good results using those 30-second spots, but we try to vary the creative up.
Abe Adams, thanks very much. This was great.
Okay.
We are going to break to roundtables, and in fact, if you want to ask more questions,